Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into something you might associate with, cozy fireplaces and holiday sentiment, the dense, dark, steamed British pudding.
Right.
It's an institution, a real centerpiece of tradition. But today, we need to treat this dessert not as a simple recipe. No, we're treating it more like a historical document that requires a deep dig.
That is exactly the mission. We're doing what you could call cultural archaeology. We're moving beyond that cozy Dickensian image to really examine the economic and cultural history that's baked right into it.
And what we uncover is pretty complex.
It is. This history of a simple comfort food is rooted in these massive global systems of exploitation.
So we're looking past the taste to understand the cost.
The human cost.
The actual human cost of making those ingredients available to an average British home.
Exactly. We're connecting the dots from the recipe all the way back to the global systems that source them, which is primarily the triangular trade. And the finding is, well, it's unavoidable. The foundation of this classic British tradition was laid on the other side of the Atlantic, and it was completely underpinned by the brutal system of slavery.
So let's start there with the building blocks, the signature flavors that really define the classic British pudding. What are the key commodities we need to be talking about, according to our sources?
It's basically a shopping list of colonial power. You've got sugar, rum, nutmeg, cinnamon, cocoa, and dried fruits.
All preserved in molasses or alcohol.
Right. And if you look at that list, you see two things jump out. The bulk sweetener, sugar, and then all these powerful exotic flavorings.
And in 18th century England, these weren't items you just casually picked up at the market, especially sugar. You've noted that sugar was an entirely different class of commodity.
Oh, absolutely. This is where the economic context is just vital. Sugar, in particular, was what we call a meta commodity. It literally rivaled gold in its economic importance.
Rivaled gold.
Yeah.
That's a huge claim.
It's not hyperbole. We tend to think of sugar as just food, but in the 1700s, it was the oil of its day.
How did that even work? How did it manifest in the global economy?
Well, for one, sugar became essential collateral for major international loans. Banking systems in London and Amsterdam were literally fueled by the expected revenue from sugar crops.
Wow.
And on a more practical level, the taxes levied on imported sugar generated crucial revenue. That revenue helped sustain the British Navy and funded the whole project of imperial expansion. It was the lubricant of empire.
And where did this incredibly valuable commodity actually come from?
Almost entirely from the forced labor of enslaved African people. They were working under absolutely unforgiving conditions on these huge plantations in the West Indies.
So we're talking about places like Jamaica, Barbados.
Barbados, Antigua, the Great Sugar Islands. The intense demand for sugar in Britain directly drove the demand for slave labor in the Caribbean. And the boom this created directly enriched British port cities like London and Bristol.
So if we trace the pudding's sweetness back to its source, the root of that flavor is right there. It's in that exchange of brutal, forced labor for massive profit.
Absolutely. And you can't forget the flavorings either. The nutmeg, the cinnamon, the cocoa. These were also acquired through, consolidating imperial control over trade routes in South Asia and the Caribbean. The pudding's whole flavor profile is basically a map of British colonial reach.
Which makes perfect sense. And to bring all these things together, the sugar, the spices, the rum, we have to talk about the engine that made it all flow. We're talking about the triangular trade.
That system is the engine that, perhaps unintentionally, defines so much of British cuisine. What's crucial for you to grasp is how the pudding's ingredients fit perfectly into the final, most profitable stage of this three-part cycle.
Okay, so let's break down those three legs for everyone listening, focusing on that flow of goods.
Of course. So the first leg started in England. Ships left with manufactured goods, weapons, cloth, metal tools. These were shipped to Africa and used to purchase human beings.
The second leg being the Middle Passage.
The devastating journey, the transportation of enslaved people from Africa to the Americas and the Caribbean to work those industries.
The journey that provided the labor force.
Precisely. And then came the third leg, which was the economic bonanza for Britain. The Caribbean and the Americas shipped high-value commodities back to England. The ships would return just loaded to the gunwales with sugar, cocoa, tobacco, and, critically for our pudding, rum.
So the celebratory ingredients, the things that made their way into a comfortable British home, the dark molasses, the cheap sugar, the dried fruits soaked in rum, they were literally the profitable cargo from the final leg of that horrific cycle.
Yes, and it created this undeniable paradox. This system allowed for the democratization of what became British cuisine, but it simultaneously destroyed millions of lives. The sheer volume of these commodities arriving in British ports was staggering. It completely transformed how people ate.
It's why the sources use that phrase, that the legendary dessert was, in a sense, cooked in the shadow of slave ships.
It was. And that brings us to the recipe itself. If sugar went from a rarity, almost like a medicine, to something so cheap and available because of slave labor, well, how did that change the pudding?
You see the economy actually rewriting the cookbook?
That's exactly right. Look at the early puddings from the 17th century. They were structurally different.
They were savory, right?
Very. More of a mix of flour, beer, some meat, fat, dried raisins, and only some sugar. They were closer to a sausage or a medieval hash.
So when did it make the jump? When did it become the sweet bomb we know today?
The defining moment was the 18th century. The relentless increase in forced labor made Caribbean sugar so plentiful and cheap that it became accessible to the average British family.
Especially the growing working class in the cities.
Exactly. And that massive shift in availability allowed sugar to completely take over as the dominant flavor and the main structural element.
So that cheap sugar fueled a transformation from these medieval dishes. I think one source mentions cooking pelicans.
Right, showing how unstructured and protein-heavy they were.
Into the sweet, dense, rum-flavored object we know today.
And that transition had huge social implications. The pudding became the family taste of the Industrial Revolution.
Why that specifically?
Because the working population, laboring in factories, needed cheap, calorically dense fuel. Sugar provided that fuel. The pudding was just the perfect delivery mechanism. Making it sweet, dense, and storable was a direct result of having cheap, slave-produced Caribbean sugar.
That's a fascinating and direct line. The brutality on a plantation floor directly translated into the daily calories of a factory worker in London.
It is the ultimate connection between the economic driver and cultural consumption.
Which sets the stage for this profound cultural irony in the 19th century. By the Victorian era, the economic source of the pudding was what largely ignored.
Completely ignored. The pudding was now loaded with a symbolic meaning that just erased its origins.
It became all about domestic bliss.
Home life, family tranquility, tradition, and the spirit of Noel. It served a real psychological need for the public to see their consumption as wholesome.
And of course, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol solidified this. He puts the pudding right at the center of the Cratchit family table. It becomes this sacred symbol of loving unity.
Which really raises a necessary question for us, How could something sourced from a system that was actively breaking apart families,
The slave trade,
be so successfully rebranded as a pure, innocent symbol of cozy domestic unity in England? The cultural distance was manufactured to justify the economic engine.
The physical distance between a warm kitchen in London and the sugar fields in Jamaica was vast.
But the economic connection was terrifyingly direct.
And we have some historical documents from the sources that just lay this irony bare.
One of the most chilling is from a Bristol merchant's diary in 1772. It's in the Bristol University archives. The merchant wrote, and this is a direct quote, "Every Noel pudding is a celebration of our profit. We never thank the hands that provided that profit."
Wow. That is essentially an admission. They knew the source, and they just chose to enjoy it while consciously ignoring the human cost.
It's a moment of really unsettling clarity. And then there's the grim tradition recorded on the Jamaica plantations themselves. On Christmas Day, the English masters would give the enslaved people a single pudding-like sugary gruel.
Their only allotted sweet treat for the entire year?
Yes. A crude, mock version of the decadent thing being eaten thousands of miles away, served once a year to the very people whose labor produced the core ingredient.
And we can't fully appreciate this without talking about the rum.
The rum connection.
It just cements the pudding's complete reliance on this system.
It's key to the flavor, right? Used to soak the fruit, poured over, and flamed for drama. But rum itself is a direct byproduct of sugarcane molasses. It was a perfect secondary source of profit, so its entire production was dependent on the very same slave labor system as the sugar. There's no separation.
So the sugar, the molasses-soaked fruit, the rum, every pillar of the British pudding is tied to the economics of the triangular trade.
It's the hard truth. All the technical elements, the long steaming, the soaking, are completely secondary to the economic forces that made the ingredients possible and cheap.
This brings us to the academic consensus. This isn't just a footnote. It's a foundational finding in food studies. What do the key historians tell us about the so what of this connection?
They contextualize it perfectly. Sidney Mintz's book, Sweetness and Power, from 1985. He explains how sugar became not just an economic power, but a tool of cultural control. He confirms that English dessert culture was fundamentally dependent on forced labor.
And James Walvin's work, Sugar, The World Corrupted.
Walvin provides the brutal data. He shows the direct correlation between the English demand for sugar, which just skyrockets in the 18th century, and the escalating growth of the slave trade needed to feed it.
The two charts move in lockstep.
They do. And then you have Michael Twitty's work on Caribbean culinary culture, which emphasizes how this shaped the food of both the colonizer and the colonized.
So the synthesis across all these studies is clear.
It is. English dessert culture rose on sugar. Sugar rose on slave labor. That's the consensus. The pudding is a tangible result of that reality.
Knowing this, it adds a strange, bitter taste to every technique you read in a traditional recipe. The density, the dark color, it's all a reflection of an economic boom built on suffering.
It is. And in terms of legacy, the pudding didn't just become a holiday food. It became the ultimate symbol of English culinary identity.
And at the same time, one of the most visible examples of colonial food. It holds both of those meanings.
Because its core components, sugar, rum, spice, were the direct reflections of the imperial system that brought them home.
Cultural historians call it what was the phrase?
A sweet-looking trace of colonialism. A reminder that even the most comforting traditions can mask a deep and violent history. Food is never just food.
So this deep dive really forces you to look at tradition through a critical lens. You realize that enjoying a British pudding isn't just consuming fruit, sugar, and fat. You're consuming history.
And when you encounter this dessert, you're also encountering one of the major economic veins of the British Empire. That single sweet dish can carry a taste as complex as history itself, and sometimes, as bitter as humanity's mistakes.
Which forces us to ask a difficult but necessary question every time we encounter a food that's called traditional. You have to ask, what commodity made this cheap enough to become a tradition, and where did the labor that produced that commodity truly come from? That is the real legacy here, a piece of cultural history that forces a reckoning with global economics.